Welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's live stream of examining the report, Why Erie's Downtown is a Proxy for the Nation, the Future of Main Street Businesses Amidst the COVID-19 Crisis. I'm Ben Speggen, and I'm the Vice President of the Jefferson Educational Society and a contributing editor at the Erie Reader and one of the co-authors of that report. With me for this discussion is Bruce Katz, the founding director of the Nowak Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University, and a partner with Accelerator for America to scale and replicate innovative economic development finance tools across the country. Bruce is also the co-author with the late Jeremy Nowak of The New Localism, How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism. Bruce and I are going to discuss that report, why we wrote it, when we wrote it, details of that report, key recommendations, follow-ups to it, and where we find ourselves now. Folks, in the comment section of this post and elsewhere on the Jefferson's Facebook page, you can find links to that report, the follow-up newsletter that Bruce and I wrote, additional reports that Bruce has authored since, coverage of our report from James Fallows in The Atlantic, and more. You can find all of those resources or directions on where to access them also on the Jefferson's website at jeserie.org. And of course, if you have a question for Bruce and me, please do leave it in the comments section below. We're going to try to get through as many as we can during our time together here. Bruce, a big thanks to you for joining the conversation on Facebook live stream.
Well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
So Bruce, the first place I'd like to start, since you had this idea to write this report and you'd reached out to me, why do this report on Erie now as we look at the COVID-19 crisis, what it means for the economic ecosystem for this country?
Well, I have thought for some time, since meeting you and a whole bunch of your colleagues at Jefferson and Perry Wood at the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority and others in the Erie ecosystem, that Erie's revival is very much emblematic of what is happening in small cities and urban counties around the United States. What we've seen really in the past 15 years is the revival of downtowns and the revival of main streets, not just for consumption, restaurants, bars, coffee shops, et cetera, but also as new hubs of innovative activity. And I thought, going back a month, as we were beginning to see the limits on consumerism placed as necessarily placed because of the coronavirus, that we could potentially lose in weeks what it's taken essentially a decade and a half to build in many of these places. And since we wrote that, I think more and more there's an understanding throughout the country that so many small businesses, and we're really talking about businesses with, let's say, less than 10 employees, 5 employees in many parts of this country, are at risk. And a good portion of what has been acted as part of the Congressional CARES Act, the relief package running through the Small Business Administration, may not really be aligned with the needs of many of these small businesses. So literally today, the Senate is debating the next version of the rescue package. And, as we go forward with this conversation, I can talk about some new proposals we put on the table in the last day or so to help funnel more capital, appropriate capital, to small businesses at risk.
So I do want to get to that. And for those that maybe perhaps are a little less familiar with the new localism, I wanted to dive into that early because in the newsletter follow-up that we had published on March 25th, toward the end there, we wrote, the Republic doesn't yet have the right tools or the institutions to get the job done alone. We need the new localism on steroids. So in a nutshell, can you recap what new localism is, why this makes sense right now for this crisis?
Absolutely. So Jeremy Nowak and I basically had an observation, which had been baking for quite some time, that so much of the problem solving in the United States today and over the past 2 decades has really come from the bottom up. And it's come not just from city governments, but this broad network of public, private, civic, university, health, community stakeholders. I mean, cities, unlike the federal government and state governments, are not governments, they're networks. And they really function and realize their full potential when that kind of collaborative and cohesive network is put into full use. Erie, to a large extent, reflects one of the best examples of new localism around your downtown revival, because what you see is all members of the community basically saying, we have an incredible location here. We've got sort of a late 19th century, small downtown. And given the shifts in demographic preferences and the shifts in how businesses think about how innovation occurs as a collaborative process across multiple sectors and disciplines, the revival of Erie's downtown was really a product of multiple players coming to the table and really leveraging these broader forces. So Erie in some way is one of the best reflections of new localism. We mentioned it in the book. But as this crisis has taken hold, both on the public health side and on the economic revival side, what we've seen is cities, counties, and states basically stepping up to take on challenges that the federal government, outside of some of these legislative packages, has really failed to sort of grapple with it in an efficient and effective way.
And so I want to be able to thank you for that, Bruce, and I want to be able to dive into some of where we found ourselves when we were writing the report and what's happened since. But one of the things that I think was key to the report that we're trying to point out is that this crisis is so far different than anything that we had been prepared for before. We found ourselves flat-footed in terms of not knowing how to react because of the scope of the crisis, that this is really nationwide. In the report, we point out, it's one thing when a tornado rips through the Midwest or a hurricane sweeps up the Panhandle or through the Gulf. Those are geographically based, and we know how to deploy resources to only a particular small portion of the country that may have been impacted by that. But this is an entire nationwide shutdown. And one of the things that I think that you had written so eloquently in the report was this idea of these lifeless movie sets. And so I'd love to hear you elaborate on that a little bit for those tuning in, the idea of the infrastructure still being intact, but no one being there.
Well, I think that's a great lead-in, because this is unlike any kind of natural disaster, which tends to be geographically contained because of a hurricane or flooding or a tornado, and time limited. It just hits and then moves on. This is like a hurricane is happening in every part of the country ad infinitum. We don't really know when it's going to end. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty that has occurred here. So, not surprisingly, Congress reached into the traditional toolbox of disaster assistance, which may not be necessarily well aligned to the nature of this crisis. And because so many small businesses exist, literally from month to month, like many of the households in this country, they've got enough cash reserves to make it through the next month, to pay their employees, to pay rent, to pay utilities. Perhaps there's a loan. They've purchased goods or services from another small business. So they're living on the brink. And this economic shutdown, it's not a contraction, it's a shutdown, basically has thrown, many small businesses into a total state of panic. So if you think about these downtown revivals or Main Street revivals or commercial corridors, where you have so many of these service businesses that are providing really the soul and the culture of a place, but they are living on a brink from a revenue and expenses perspective. If we don't preserve a large portion of these small businesses, we're going to wake up when this crisis passes, and we're going to have essentially empty movie sets or stage sets as our downtowns. The buildings will be intact. This is not like a tornado or a hurricane, but there'll be no business populating them. And so it is much harder to rebuild than to preserve, is the bottom line. And we should be doing as much as possible right now to preserve as many of these micro businesses as possible.
I know one of the things that we had touched on, I think, back and forth in our phone calls when we were drafting the report is really that image of flipping the switch, and being able to, once we can once we can no longer be under the constraints of social distancing, when people are able to go back to these places, that how do we make sure that that switch can be flipped, and that folks can return there, because the infrastructure hasn't been demolished, hasn't been effective. And I think that it's really important to note that it's not uncommon for these small businesses to go month to month, especially those that are still in the startup territory of just being a few years old. And sometimes it's even less for those that are in the service industry or the restaurant industry, where instead of a month, it might be closer to 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. And so in choosing Ember and Forge and Lavery Brewing Company as those models, for those that are looking into the report, I think what was important for us, and Bruce, what you had mentioned earlier, was the idea of the feel of that downtown footprint, and to be able to really walk from one place to another, and the idea of the places that make a place and give it a feel. And Bruce, you talked about that social glue, the service that these places provide. And that one of the challenges, when it comes to measuring the vitality or the importance of these businesses, is that it's sometimes hard to really put a number to that, of the services that they provide, of where folks can show up. And so, one of the recommendations that we had talked about in the report was that it must be understood that looking at these small businesses, they reveal an intricate web of relationships that surround, even the smallest Main Street businesses. And Bruce, so I want to have you talk a little bit about the Cheers economy, and why I think that aside from, I think that maybe that's a hashtagable trend on Twitter, but I think it really helps us understand these places, not just in Erie, Pennsylvania, but really beyond, of what they do when we think of a Cheers economy.
Well, it also shows how I'm dating myself, because that's probably the last time I was really watching television. But Cheers economy, where everyone knows your name. I that really is Ember and Forge and Lavery Brewing. I mean, these are obviously businesses, and their founders and owners are trying to make a go of it. But they also are gathering places. They really show why our cities have, and their downtowns and main streets beyond, have come back as really centers of economic and civic life. People want community. So, what cities really are about is density, and distancing is anti-density. And so I think it's hard to put a number to some of these businesses. They really have created a certain kind of vibe, a feel, what many call the experiential economy, that has emerged over the past decade or 2 decades. And we have to think very carefully about how we bring that back post-crisis. If we don't find a cure, or if we don't find a vaccine, I think the number one issue that's going to define the post-crisis period is going to be about confidence, that you can walk into a coffee shop or a restaurant or any business establishment and not worry about your own health. We're all hoping that we do find a cure or a vaccine. If we don't, we have to focus intensely on what's it going to take to give people security and certainty about their own health. And I think in the meantime, we've got to basically keep these companies and businesses alive, or again, the rebuild will be a lot slower, a lot more painful than people think. I think there's a lot of irrational exuberance at times in the markets. They think, we're just going to have a bounce back immediately in the economy. I think this is going to be longer and deeper than is understood. And it means that we have to think very carefully both about the rescue effort that we have underway. It's not a stimulus package. It's a rescue act. It's a survival act. And then moving it towards the ultimate rebuild and recovery period.
Well, and thinking about the impact of social distancing, which is absolutely necessary when it comes to the public health crisis for this, those measures being necessary, how those affect businesses that rely on that foot traffic, that rely on that density. And I can't help but think that, we continue to talk about the metric that we're looking for is flattening the curve, in terms of looking for when the country as a whole stops peaking, and then states individually stop peaking, and then regions of states, and then down to counties. And so looking for flattening that curve. I think too that that's applied to these small businesses in terms of the bottom out of, looking at the difference between a week this year under this crisis compared to last year's numbers at the same time, finding when that curve's going to be flattened. I know initially when we talked to Jason and Hannah, Jason had revealed, he was about 50% down, and that's continuing to trend downward compared week to week. We haven't seen the flattening of that yet. And so we're trying to look for ways that businesses can be creative with that, whether it's takeout or carry out, or selling merchandise, but we're finding that that's, it's challenging to flatten that curve. Two, I think that one of the things that we found was challenging is that, in measuring COVID-19's impact, we can look at tests and test kits and availability to look at the overall health. And then in looking at the overall unemployment numbers, we can get a sense of what the economy at large appears to be, but there's not really a good metric system for looking at the health and wellness of small businesses and understanding that vitality compared the last year to this year, and where do we stand in the ecosystem for that. And so how frustrating has that been for you in trying to unpack this, to understand, how challenging it is not to have good metrics to be able to understand that? Because I think that we think the more data we have, the better we're going to be able to forecast, but it seems like we're missing a big gap in that data.
Well, it's a very curious thing because the small business economy in the United States, a lot of political leaders and business leaders like to extol the virtues of it, but small business in the U.S. is defined as any establishment with less than 500 employees. I think if you did a sort of focus group in downtown Erie and say, what do you think of small businesses? I think most people would say probably less than 25 or 10 or 5. So we have this big group of establishments of less than 500 employees. And not surprisingly, I think some of the federal response has been to sort of focus on probably mid-sized companies that already have established banking relationships with products they easily can access, than to the smallest of the small. I think small business data in the U.S. is an oversight of monumental proportions. The last national survey of small business in the U.S. was conducted in 2012. That's the last one. I mean, a few things have happened in the last 8 years, last time I checked. We've been waiting literally this spring for the 2017 data. And data geeks like me were very excited to see about, the changes that would have happened in that 5-year period. We still don't have it. So we don't have a scorecard, literally, city to city, county to county, state to state, and for the country, that gives everyone a level set of the kind of businesses they have by sector, by size, by race, by ethnicity, women-owned businesses. It's a really a flawed, failure, a flawed data system that has to be, one of the things that will come out of this, which I think could ultimately fuel more entrepreneurialism and dynamism, is a kind of information set that we can all rely on and then use to set actionable strategies and investments.
And so I think it shouldn't go without note, just a big thanks to Hannah and to Jason from Ember and Forge and for Lavery Brewing Company. I think as James Fallows put it in his coverage of the report for The Atlantic, it was a tell-all, tell us everything. Yes, and then they really opened up their books and were willing to bare their soul. And I remember one of the conversations we had early with Jason, where he was not surprised at our question of, can we see all of your numbers and then tell the world all of your numbers, where he said, I'm willing to share with anybody else because I want to get better at this. We're better when we all work together. And that was one of the things that I think was remarkable that came out of that piece, that there is an energy around small businesses when it comes to wanting to collaborate and wanting to look for local responses. One of the local responses that you had mentioned earlier that we had featured in the report is the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority's Relief and Recovery Plan. And so one of the questions we do have coming into us, and thanks for those submitting those questions. I know we're getting some via email. Also, if you have a question, you can just leave it in the comments section right below. One of our team members at the Jefferson is going to get that over to me. But one of the questions that we do have coming in is aside from ECRA, what other models have you seen, Bruce, in your observation that are working locally, be them small metros or mid-sized metros or large ones? And if you want to elaborate a little on ECRA, we can. But the reason I feel like it was easy to feature that in our report was they deployed quickly. And it was a rather seamless process in terms of, here's the amount of funding that's going to be made available. Here's how it's made available. Here's how to get it. Here's how to apply. And it was a rather easier process to connect small businesses, nonprofits, and some mid-sized businesses to the resources that they needed in the now. So I feel like that was one of the reasons we were able to highlight that. But Bruce, other things you're seeing across the country as small, as local is learning from local.
Yeah, I think what happened, starting first with Seattle and San Francisco and New York, since they were on the front lines of the crisis, let's say 3 to 4 weeks ago, is they started setting up these local emergency funds. And we profiled this last week and then yesterday. We actually did a deep dive into ECRA, Birmingham, and Indianapolis to show 3 local relief efforts that were quickly stood up and have been very effective in a very short period of time at deploying capital. What we found is there are really 5 efforts underway in the U.S. Some have been set up by local government or county government or state government. Some have been set up by public authorities like ECRA or quasi-public corporations. Some by philanthropy, some by financial institutions, and some by business chambers. And these are not, stovepipes and silos. A lot of times a philanthropy will be funding the local government response, or the local government will be funding the business chamber response. But what we've seen is this immediate response from these disparate stakeholders in cities and counties to basically meet immediate need with products that in many cases have just been grants to businesses that are starved for capital. This is actually the model that's been used in Switzerland, the model that's been used in Berlin. The federal response has been to come up with a particular kind of loan product based on payroll, mostly sort of delivered by financial institutions. Some of the European countries went more to a grant model. Just get them capital, get it as fast as possible, and we'll see how long this crisis persists. So that's why yesterday we proposed a $40 billion Main Street Emergency Act, which would essentially allow the Congress to send money to cities, counties, and states, and then to top up these local relief efforts that in many cases are in the millions. They need to be in the tens of millions if we try to activate the whole country and all the capacity of this country to deal with this crisis. The banks by themselves are not the only delivery system in the United States. And I think it's a huge lesson out of the last 2 weeks. And these local relief efforts are smart, and they show this distributed set of actors we have in this country that right now could be fully leveraged.
So in that proposal, one of the questions that came in quickly from that, Bruce, is why 40 billion? How did you get to that number? Because we're hearing such large numbers when it comes to, and I think it was important to echo your earlier statement. This is not stimulus. This is recovery and relief. How did you get to that number? Why does that number make sense?
Oh, I'm happy to share all that. I mean, we're dealing with a subset of the market here. We're dealing with small businesses under a certain size, or perhaps located in a low and moderate income community. And what we did is we basically, from the bottom up, looked at a lot of the funds that had already emerged, looked at the initial oversubscription that they were basically facing, and then scaled it to the country as a whole. That's not the perfect methodology, but it gets back to your data point, Ben. We don't have a perfect methodology. This was very consistent with some other data analysis that was being done by a group called Next Street in collaboration with the Cincinnati Minority Business Accelerator. So I'm happy to share everything as we've been doing this. It ain't perfect. If Congress put in $75 billion as opposed to $40 billion, from my perspective, that would be absolutely needed right now. But we were trying to come up with some, baseline to build from. And we only took this to the end of June. If you take it to the end of July, then the numbers begin to go up fairly substantially.
Another question that's come in, Bruce, and you can be as blunt as you'd like with it. Give a grade to the rollout of the CARES Act and the PPP when it comes to helping small business. What grade would you give that?
So I used to be chief of staff at HUD under the Clinton administration. I went back into the Obama administration. I would just say that I have an enormous respect for the civil service at the federal level right now. They are being given almost an impossible task. I mean, SBA, Small Business Administration, generally, again, with FEMA, the Emergency Management Agency, they go into these small, contained disaster zones. They set up field offices. They set up call centers. This is a whole different game. We're all basically operating from our basements. So I think that the rollout of PPP has been fast, but the product is imperfect and the delivery system is imperfect as designed. So I think some of this is just built into the product design. Again, if you're a mid-sized company with a friendly banker, and you were already on the phone 3 weeks ago, what are my options? Either through bank loans or some of the federal guarantee, backed loans. You're in a very different position than a mom and pop, sitting on a main street or in a downtown or in a community that doesn't have that kind of relationship particularly with the large national banks in the United States. So I think they chose one vehicle and one avenue here to go down. And it works for a certain segment of small business. It does not work for a very large, group of small businesses. And that's why we need more shots on goal here. We need more options. And the variety and the diversity that's emerging from the bottom should be reverse engineered to dictate a different kind of federal policy response.
And so another question coming in.
Call your congressman.
So I think that's a great follow up. I'll pause on the audience question for a second though, but just general recommendations we have right now. I mean, the bulk of us are sitting at home, other than those on the front lines that are still headed into, essential work. And certainly a big thanks to those, who are still showing up to the hospitals and the places that are keeping us all going. But a lot of us now are sitting at home. I'm sitting at home in a home office. You're doing the same thing. It sounds simple with call your congressman, but what else can people do? How should they be reacting in terms of, I've got a small business I care about. How do I communicate that to the people that represent me?
Well, in some ways, it goes back again to your data point. This country, perhaps more than many countries, is driven by evidence and driven by storytelling. And that's why I think what you and I tried to do in that Erie report was to try to take a very complicated challenge and really sort of narrow down to two small businesses that everyone in this country can relate to. Because in many respects, it's the kind of small businesses they want to support. So as we go forward, I think we need a feedback loop, essentially, where Jefferson Educational Society and some of your colleagues are basically choosing a few small businesses, maybe at different sizes, maybe in different sectors, maybe in different locations, to follow, so that every step of the way there's some feedback loop as to, is this one path that Congress has chosen, or some of the more traditional SBA products, do they work? Or do we really need to supersize the ECRA fund or other funds that could be set up at the local level? And bottom line, we're not just talking about small businesses. We're also talking about community nonprofits, the arts sector, the culture sector, which again is the lifeblood of our communities. It's about the civic pride of our communities. So many of these funds that have been set up at the local level in the United States, I was just talking to the New Haven Community Foundation this morning. Many of them are as focused on nonprofits as they are on small businesses. Because if we wake up with a desert here or with an empty movie set, again, the rebuild's going to be painful. It will be different models that come out of this, different kind of financial tools. but it'll be painful and it'll be slow.
And one of the things to note in the ECRA relief package is that there was funding there available to nonprofits,
Yes,
and so
exactly.
locals are looking for ways to do that, and it's great to be able to learn from each other. And I know, here in Erie, I've had conversations with the Erie Downtown Partnership, to see what their response has been, in the Erie Regional Chamber and Growth Partnership to see what their response has been. Really trying to get an understanding of what's happening now in real time, and how aid can be sent more quickly and more appropriately funneled to where it needs to go. And so I think that tails nicely into a question from the audience here is we get unemployment numbers every week, and we are seeing those continue to go up. But do we know the number of small businesses that have closed? Is anybody databasing that at this point? Because it looks like it's all local at this point. Locals reporting on local.
We don't have any numbers that you can take to the bank, so to speak. I mean, we have surveys, but if you go into any downtown, any commercial corridor, any main street, or any particular sector, the whole supply chain in the manufacturing sector, for example, everyone is scrambling right now to come up with data that is precise and is granular and is real time as the testing data or the mask data or the ventilator data or unemployment insurance. So this is the failure of a country which is, it's an incredibly innovative powerhouse, really has not been measuring small business, which we all talk about. It's this great rhetorical flourish we'll hear from our leaders. But we really haven't been measuring this with the kind of preciseness and precision we need at a period like this. So that's why if anyone takes a look at my methodology, everyone can poke holes in it till the cows come home. But at this point, it's good enough for government work, I would presume, to decide what's the kind of investment we need that can go out fast to businesses that are clearly not participating in the mainstream system.
Right, and that's what I think is an important section of the report, where we talk about Renaissance interrupted, and really going back to the idea that for places like Erie, Pennsylvania, to get to where it's gotten to now has not been an overnight success story. That's really been decades in the making. And one of the lines that I'd loved back from your Metropolitan Revolution days is find the best version of yourself and be it, harkening back to Dolly Parton there of really your 21st century version of yourself. And so a lot of legacy cities have been working on trying to figure out what's next, and that's really been that network of downtowns, and that it's not just one industry that's going to carry a city through. It's not just two industries that are going to carry a city through. Then it really reveals that density. One of the things that we didn't touch on yet, Bruce, and people might be curious in the audience, is just simply put, why loans don't make sense, for small businesses at this point. Because if you can just take out a loan to get you through the crisis, why not do that? Why not just take a loan now? And from both, Hannah and Jason, they struggled with that decision of whether they were going to pursue more loans. And we know many other businesses are cautious about that as well. Why don't loans make sense in this? Because you talked about grants being, really key to some of the European models. Why loans aren't really fit to purpose here?
Well, I think there's an aversion to taking on more debt when you don't entirely know what the future holds. There's just a level of uncertainty, and different kinds of businesses have different levels of indebtedness. Now, the way they structured the Paycheck Protection Program was as a forgivable loan, what Perry Wood calls groans. But there's still a lot of complexity and ambiguity about that as it's getting rolled out. And it was particularly focused on payroll and paycheck protection at a time when many small businesses had already laid off a lot of their workers. So in some ways, there's like a misalignment of the timing of the federal response to the reality of what happens on the ground. That's why these local relief efforts tend to be much more perfectly matched to what's going on, because these local entities literally are seeing some of these small businesses in the Ember and Forge coffee shops. I mean, that's the kind of feedback loop you have at the local level that you begin to lose when you get to the national level. Again, what SBA is doing right now works for a certain segment of small business. It should be a tool in the toolbox. It is hopefully getting implemented and executed as quickly as possible. That's so much about the banks as it is about the SBA. Let's be clear about that. It's much about the financial institutions and how quickly they're moving. But there need to be more channels. We're a very complex networked economy, much more than any other country in the world, much more than any other country in the world. And we've got more potential to put more shoulders to the wheel here. So I think that's what has to happen literally through the next couple of days as Congress considers the rescue package number 4. And then there'll be 5, 6, 7, and 8. But right now, we need to open up more channels and more kinds of products that align with the needs of small business.
Well, and with that complexity, I think one of the important things that we wanted to make sure people saw in the report is that the challenge presented to this crisis when it comes to small businesses is that another thought response could be, well, if I can only just defer my rent for my small business for the next 3 months, well, in some cases that might be doable, but in many it tends to be the lender or your landlord is a small business themselves, and so how far can they afford to extend that, what that might look like. And sometimes for some of these loans they require a substantial amount of collateral. And so for a lot of these businesses that don't own their own property, they don't have collateral. Their equipment is valuable to what they do and they make, but overall putting a dollar figure on that, it's not something significant enough to be able to perhaps qualify for the loan. One of the other questions we have coming in for the audience is that Erie's renaissance lately, within the last few years, has been we've seen a lot of attention being paid to Erie around opportunity zones and what that's meant in the local investment and buy-in. So if you're forecasting, Bruce, what is the impact on opportunity zone investment looking like amidst this crisis? How disruptive is that?
Well, I think it's going to be quite disruptive. I do think that opportunity zones, because they chose a quarter of some of the highest poverty communities in the United States, and that was the geographic targeting. They're giving us a pretty good sense of the places that are most at risk of really economic collapse post-crisis, because many of these places were not really receiving much market capital to begin with. Particularly the most highly disadvantaged neighborhoods. I think going forward, we need more tools in the toolbox. I mean, opportunity zones as a tax incentive, giving people with large capital gains the ability to defer or reduce or even eliminate capital gains taxes, was working initially somewhat well for real estate, but it wasn't really working for the kind of small business investing that we're going to need to really focus on post-crisis. And I think for that, we're going to need a lot more different kinds of products than just the traditional SBA, federally guaranteed debt products that carry an interest rate of 4% or so forth. I think we're going to need a broader suite of products. And I think some of those products will actually get invented during this crisis. I'm watching very closely Cincinnati right now. Cincinnati may be raising a fund that really has a much broader suite of products, both to help small businesses survive and then help them quickly kick back into high gear once the crisis passes. So opportunity zones was always an imperfect tool. It was the right geographic focus in many respects. And it catalyzed an enormous amount of collaborative effort, particularly in places like Erie. So this sort of coming together that happened in places like Erie and Birmingham and Kansas City and elsewhere, that has helped you stand up these local relief funds very quickly, because in a way it gave you a better sense of your market than most other places. But I think going forward, what's going to happen as a part of this, I think, is the entire way we measure the small business economy, mentor, nurture, capitalize small businesses at different sizes across different sectors. I think that's going to change. This is going to be a level of restructuring that, frankly, we should have been doing 20 years ago. but now is going to be propelled by this crisis.
Well, I think that's, part of the biggest hope, and I think we had hit on that in the report, is that, if we found ourselves unprepared for the crisis, in which we did, we should not be equally unfit to the task of recovery. And two, that it'd be a fool's errand to think, something like this may not happen again, and that we need to be better prepared for the next time something like this does happen, where we're looking at a total economic shutdown, not just a restriction, not just a time-sensitive crippling of the economy, but really a full shutdown. I want to go back to one of your earlier statements. Folks are asking, how up-to-date can you get us on what the talks in the Senate are looking like right now? I know you mentioned the work that you had just done recently with the proposal for the $40 million relief effort, but you had mentioned earlier what's going on in the Senate. Can you give us a sense of what's happening today, Thursday, April 9th, where federal government is right now?
Well, what has happened literally in the last couple hours is Senator McConnell tried to move a unanimous consent in the Senate to move an extra $250 billion into the SBA Paycheck Protection Program. That's what the administration had requested. What has happened is the House, first of all, that unanimous consent did not pass. Senator Cardin from Maryland and Senator Von Hollen from Maryland, both from Maryland, basically objected, and now we're into, as you can imagine, the kind of negotiations that normally ensue. The House, Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, countered to the administration proposal to raise SBA PPP by $250 billion by saying we will do $250 billion, but we want half of that to flow through community development financial institutions, so that we know that it gets to underserved communities and underserved businesses. And then separately, they also asked for an increase of about $150 billion for states, cities, and counties to shore up their revenue base because of the loss of tax revenue. So obviously, we're into negotiations right now. I think it would be wonderful if in the next couple days we increased funding for SBA PPP, because that does serve a certain segment of the market, but opened up channels through community development institutions and directly to cities, counties, and states, serve a much broader set of small businesses, and provided some more support for state and local governments. That would be a great resolution for this next package. And then we'll have another package in the next couple of weeks. But I think, what we're seeing is a back and forth within the Senate and between the House and the Senate that I think is reflective of how, complex this is across the country and how diverse the needs of small businesses and the needs of governments are at this point.
Well, I think that one of the things too that this crisis has certainly revealed for us are the various inequities that exist throughout the country, whether that's small businesses serving minority populations, minority-owned small businesses, businesses that lack that technological connection even. Right. One of the things we're seeing here in Erie is that not all businesses can turn to a Facebook, and be able to broadcast out their needs to their community. And so this is really revealing the complex problem. Bruce, I want to be sensitive of your time because I know you're working hard today and I know you've got a call right after this. But any last parting thoughts you want to leave the audience with before we go ahead and sign off here and continue trying to follow this up the best we can?
I think it's very important, for your audience, and I'm not sure how many folks are watching this. I mean, it's out into the great unknown, but to really work through some of these intermediaries like Jefferson, the Downtown Association, your chamber, to basically begin to be that feedback loop. Erie is small enough where you can literally get your arms around not just the general size of a challenge, but these very specific stories about how in real time small businesses, for example, or nonprofits are able or not able to access the capital they need. So, and you've already been the subject of a lot of national attention because of the nature of your revival over the past, decade or even, less. So this is a period where we're all socially distancing, but where with some cohesive effort, you can distill and cohere a very clear story about what's working and what's not working, and then feed it up into the national debate, through your own, traditional representatives, but also through social media, through traditional media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in many ways, the small cities are better primed to communicate than many larger places, because you've built this kind of ecosystem, and particularly ecosystems around some of these, what I would call passion-driven small businesses. What Ember and Forge are and what the brewery are, they're not just small businesses, providing this widget or this service. Hannah and Jason believe in their companies. This is like a life's work. And I think that kind of enthusiasm just exudes, So I think you've got some great opportunity in Erie, even as we're all sitting in our basements and so forth, to really pull together some very powerful stories and then inform policy and investment as we go forward.
Well, I think two of the things that has stuck with me in talking to them about the report was Hannah's willingness to be so honest with us of this is not a get rich quick scheme. That if anything, she's built a space that people in Erie can gather with her hope that two people sharing a cup of coffee are going to hatch the next idea or the next small business. That she's got the space for that. Then Jason told us, if it comes down to it, he's going to sell his house and move into the brewery because it's his baby, and that's the passion we see there. And I think that's, really the note that we end the report on is that, as any other metropolis or community, Erie is a proxy for rebuilding the nation. And it's really that look at local leading and how the federal government, perhaps how we're reverse engineering and that the federal can take cues from the local. Folks, I want to thank you all for joining us, for this live Jefferson discussion today as Bruce Katz, the founding director of the Nowak Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University, and I examined our recent report, Why Erie's Downtown is a Proxy for the Nation, the Future of Main Street Businesses Amidst the COVID-19 Crisis. Links to that report as well as other resources are available online here on the Jefferson's Facebook page, as well as our website at jeserie.org. And of course, you can follow all of Bruce's work at thenewlocalism.com. Link for that's going to be in the comments section as well for this presentation. You can keep up to date with all Jefferson programming and publications by tuning into our Facebook page, subscribing to our email list, and visiting our website. Bruce, a big hearty thank you for taking time today to join us for this talk.
Well, thanks for having me. Stay well, buy beer, drink coffee.
Great message to end on. Folks, thanks for joining us. Look forward to our next program. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sound, get your beer and coffee, stay digitally connected. We'll see you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.